All right, I am going to share the video for this week. It's about 9 minutes and 22 seconds long from Rachel Held Evans. And I've got to move this over. This was not how I was going to set it. All right, I am going to share the video for this week. Sorry for the echo. So, yeah, I'm sharing the video for this week, and then we'll come back and I'll discuss it.
Jesus for 2,000 years. And it's not about trying to update things with a hippie coffee shop or about having a pastor who wears skinny jeans and like ironic t-shirts. It's about communion and confession and baptism. It's about the sacraments of the church that we've been practicing for 2,000 years.
That doesn't, you mean reach? That doesn't sound evangelistic. How do you reach somebody through that stuff?
Oh, well, like the table, that when you think about communion and you think about how this is Christ's table, it's not my table, it's not my denomination's table, it's not your table, it's Christ's table. And anyone who is hungry is welcome to that table. Jesus makes the invitation list, not us. I think that's deeply appealing to people who long for communion with God, with their neighbor, and even with their enemies. The table has been and always will be one of the most powerful and countercultural truths of Christianity, and one of the most powerful aspects of church life. And it's something that I've kind of recently rediscovered. Growing up, we took communion maybe, I don't know, once a month, and it was a little, nothing wrong with the grape juice and the little oyster crackers, but it was just something, it wasn't central to what it meant to be part of the church. And now I've kind of just been rediscovering lately how critical communion is to the life of the church. And so now we're part of a church family that practices communion, eats from the table every single Sunday. And what I love about that is I never come home from church and say, well, I just didn't feel fed by the pastor today. I'm fed every single Sunday by the body and blood of Christ. And that shows up every Sunday. And that's enough every Sunday. And I find that really beautiful because it's not about a service or a pastor or a choir or a band that impresses me and tries to sell me another product. The gospel is not a product to be sold. It's just about gathering around that table, recognizing my need and my neighbor's need, even my priest's need, and eating from the bread of life, which is given for the life of the world. I just find that really beautiful and really powerful every single time. So I was once asked by a group of Methodists to speak at a Methodist youth retreat. So this was going to be for junior high and high school students, about 500 junior high and high school students. And this is not really my typical group, my typical readers, my typical demographic, if you will. So I was a little nervous about it. And I reworked all of my talks and worried over the material. And before every single session, I prayed, God, just help me to do right by these kids. Help me to do right by these kids. Help me to do right by these kids. Just help me to not screw this up. And it went okay. I gave my talks. Only a few of them slept through them. It wasn't a complete disaster. But after I did my presentations, I was asked by the Methodists to help serve communion at this event. And this was my first time ever serving communion. I had received it many times, but I had never served the bread and the wine. And so I was tasked with handing out the bread to 500 high school and junior high students. And as each one came by, I put this piece of bread in their cupped hands. And that's such that position of having your hands held together, cupped, ready to receive, is a very vulnerable and one of the most sacred positions a person can have. And so as all of these junior high and high school students came up to me, I put this piece of bread in their hand and I said, "This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you." And I said it to the ones who were laughing in line with their friends, to the ones who had tears streaming down their faces. I said it to the ones who I could tell were probably the class clowns, to the ones I could tell probably got picked on in school. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. And I said it to the ones who were wearing designer jeans, the ones who showed up in their pajamas, to the ones with mischievous grins, to the ones who I could just tell were wrestling with doubts, with questions. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. And after I said it about 500 times, I finally got it. Oh, this is enough. This body and this blood is enough. It's not about me doing right by these kids. It's not about me impressing them. It's about getting out of the way and letting Jesus do his thing. They weren't waiting on me. Jesus was present, Jesus was there, and Jesus was enough. And that was a really powerful experience for me, serving communion for the first time and recognizing that my insufficiency is kind of the point. Right, I wasn't up to the task, but Christ was up for the task. It wasn't about me doing right by these kids. It was about Christ having already done right by them on the cross. And so that was a really powerful experience of giving communion to people. And then there's also the other side of receiving communion. And at my church, we receive communion on our knees with our hands cupped together. And the priest comes by and puts the bread in our hands and says, "The body of Christ, bread of heaven." And that position of being on your knees with your hands cupped together, waiting to receive, is a difficult position for somebody like me to assume, because it's an expression of how my need, my helplessness. It's being ready to receive. And sometimes I like to think that I've got it all together and it's my job to give. But receiving communion reminds me of how desperately I need God, how desperately I need grace, how desperately I need the people kneeling next to me, even if we don't get along, even if I might perceive them to be my enemies. So having both given communion and received communion, I see it as this beautiful, powerful, and sufficient means of grace. It's an outward sign of inward grace, and it is always and ever enough. The body and blood of Christ is enough. I think the problem is sometimes we just tend to get in our own way. We make it all about ourselves. We try to impress people. We try to make it about theology. We try to make it about doctrine and denominationalism and our screwed up notions of who's in and who's out. And we get in the way of Christ and the table. And so I think the main thing is to learn to get out of the way and let God move. To keep in mind that what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it keeps out. It's not who it keeps away from the table. It's who it invites in. That's always been what makes the gospel powerful and countercultural and frankly offensive. So yeah, that's how communion has been working on me, wearing down my pride, wearing down my grudges, my hostility, slowly but surely.
All right. Wish I had a remote to help with the transitions here, but we'll get by. So hopefully, I'm looking and it's showing me only one person is watching live right now. So I will also post the link to that video just because that does create this kind of longer 10-minute intro. And I don't know what YouTube is going to do. I don't know if they're going to cut that. We do have licensing for it. We are allowed to use that for up to 2 weeks. And since I just downloaded it right before this started, it should be okay. But you know, computer systems do what they do, and it might block something. Who knows? So this is the video for exploring communion, and I'm gonna answer the discussion questions myself. I will post them in the comments, and I really want to encourage, and I'll post them in the comments both on the video on YouTube and on Facebook. Wherever I posted it, I'll add the questions so that you can participate in the conversation. I would really like to encourage folks to, think about their responses and type them out and talk with one another. They are personal, I understand that, and so that might be a little difficult to post online, so don't do anything you're not comfortable with, but this is the way we get to interact right now, so I do want to, if you are comfortable, encourage you to participate and answer some of these questions for yourself. You can even, as I'm speaking, if something stirs with you, put that in the comments. So the first question is, talk about your earliest memory of receiving communion. How central is communion to your understanding of the life of the church? I think my earliest memories are kind of vague and fuzzy. My parents were, I think, pretty flexible about letting us go up and receive. I don't know if, I don't remember if they really, checked to make sure that we had the exact right theology, and I don't think parents should. My parents might have. I like I said, I don't remember, but at least from a contemporary Peace USA Presbyterian perspective, I don't see a problem with anyone going to receive. There are, theological quibbles on that. I have known some who came to faith because they were allowed to receive. And typically we understand, well, at a bare minimum, we expect people to already believe, already have faith in Christ as Savior before they should receive communion. We don't do a test, we don't ask, but we just try to encourage all believers. And in general, I think that makes sense. There are stories of the history of the church where, well, it's actually like baptism, like we were talking about last week. It's a sign and a symbol of being part of the community. And so it's okay to have, I think, that gate. I think it also would make sense to say, well, if we are giving Christ, should we withhold from anyone whether or not they meet those things? Whereas baptism is a symbol of membership, and so when someone says, yes, I want to be a member, then of the wider worldwide church community, then by all means. But then I think for communion, sometimes communion itself can be an entry into welcoming and saying, we are going to include you, even if you're not sure you should be included yourself, even if you're not sure you believe. And so I think communion is huge. It is absolutely central. It's one of the things where even denominations that are much lower church still consider that concept of table, that concept of eating together, to be important. It's still a big piece of the faith, even if they don't necessarily believe in a spiritual or actual presence of Christ in the elements. And Presbyterians and Lutherans do believe different theological specifics about that. I will be honest, I will have to retouch my full knowledge. It's one of those things where I know the differences, but to get into a whole bunch of theological specifics, I definitely would need to reread some things, have a conversation. One of the things that was asked of me when I went before the Commission on Ministry back in December, back before I met the congregation, someone asked, hey, Presbyterians and Lutherans believe something different. What happens when a Lutheran comes in and wants you to explain this? And I said, I would say I would need to pull out a book and the two of us can talk about it together. That I am aware there are differences, and I went to seminary with Lutherans, but we were, very much encouraged to also explore our own faith paths. So I have a vague understanding of what is different between me and all of the myriad of different denominations that I went to seminary with. But to, put everybody in their proper box would probably take me a bit. I might confuse somebody with someone else and all that fun stuff. But in general, there's kind of a spectrum of very, very low church folks who would believe that it's just bread and wine or bread and juice. There's nothing special or spiritual or anything like that about it. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, very high church Catholic. Jesus is literally present in the body and blood, but like the elements that are being given are literally Jesus' body and blood. Presbyterians are right in the middle. It is bread and wine, it is these physical elements, but Jesus is spiritually present. There is a mystery happening, there is something going on. And then Lutherans are they're not all the way with Catholics, but there's a little bit more going on. And so that's my easy shorthand way of explaining that. But to get into more specifics and what Luther said about communion and what Calvin said about communion is a longer conversation and requires me to be able to have books in front of me to cite and explain. And so what do you think about Rachel's idea that communion is enough? That is to say, Jesus' presence does its work regardless of the quality of the preaching or the slickness of the music. And there are more questions actually to this number 2 that I'll go with. But the first thing I remember is there was a band when I was teenager called DC Talk. And one of the members was a guy named Kevin Smith. And when DC Talk broke up, each of the members went their own way. There was a guy named Toby Mac. He kind of took off on his own Christian rap career. Michael Tate became the lead singer of a group called the Newsboys. And Kevin Smith and there was a trio. Kevin Smith kind of did his solo career for a bit and then just disappeared. And I actually quite liked, more than what the other two ended up doing, I actually quite liked Kevin Smith's music. Something felt more personal and more raw and real. And especially when we talk about Christian music or Christian rock, sometimes it's just not good. They focus too much on having that Christian label on it that there's not a lot of quality to it. And they just get sales because Christians will buy it because it's labeled Christian, which is a much more financial transaction than a faith transaction. Faith shouldn't be a transaction to begin with. But it's labeled Christian. That doesn't necessarily mean it's holier than anything else. But anyway, at one point, there was an interview after Kevin Smith had disappeared for a while and he stopped recording. And someone asked him, what changed for him, what made a difference? And he said, eventually I realized that Jesus doesn't need me to make him cool. He's already everything in and of himself. He doesn't need a flashy band. He doesn't need me to be the face, to be the cool spokesperson. Jesus is enough. I just need to talk about Jesus. I don't need to create a facade. And so that really resonated with me. I found that really beautiful for him to say, oh, I realized that I don't need to sell him. I don't need to be an infomercial for Jesus. And that's something that Rachel talks about a lot, that, the the church often tries to present Jesus as this other product being sold, and that's not what we have to offer. We have a far more beautiful and complex and mysterious story and narrative and way of life to offer than a product that's going to solve all of your problems or be cool or, you know, make you more popular or whatever. Anyway, one of the rationales behind the sacraments is that they work to bring you closer to God and his grace, whether or not you're even in a state of mind or soul to feel it. How do you celebrate communion? What is that experience like for you? Are there other things in your life that are completely reliable like that? And I think that's what's beautiful about it, is even if you're just going through the motions, it's a thing that you can go through the motions of. That it is still there for us every first and third week of the month. It is still offered. And so even if your heart's not in it, you're not in the right mental or spiritual space, it builds. And that, you know, we didn't do it this week, it'll be there in 2 weeks. Are there other things in your life that are completely reliable like that? To think about that. I think with everything that even doesn't feel reliable, I've always felt caught. But I know that there are people in the world for whom that doesn't happen, that everything doesn't always work out for everyone. But I feel like I have been blessed to be one of those people that even when I'm stressed and things look horrible and I don't know what's going to happen next, I'm always okay. And for that, it's hard to say that, it's hard for me to claim that as a blessing when I look at the person next to me and say that God loves that person just as much. And so it's like that phrase there, but for the grace of God go I. That person has as much grace as I do. And so if everything's not going well for them and they're not always okay, but I always seem to be, that's not grace. That's just happenstance. That's a lot of circumstance. In my case, you know, as a middle-class white woman who was able to go and get a master's degree, that's a lot of privilege that maybe the person next to me didn't get. Number 3, Rachel said, my insufficiency is kind of the point. I wasn't up for the task, but Christ was up for the task. How do you relate to that statement? When were times in your life when you lived the same lesson Rachel learned from giving communion? Oh, gosh, every Sunday right now. You know, this is not what they train you for in seminary. They don't train you. There's actually a great meme going around if you're a fan of Star Trek, the original series. I just told Donna about this in an email yesterday, where Dr. McCoy has that famous line, "Darn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a whatever, fill in the blank." And the meme going around said, "I'm a pastor, Jim, not a videographer." And so there's a lot of this. I know because I'm young, it may seem like I know all of this technology, but a lot of the things that I'm trying and doing, I'm doing for the first time. And so, you know, like the screen sharing and trying to figure out how to get music to fit in and all of that, it's all new. I am somewhat equipped and familiar enough with technology that I know what to try and to go through trial and error, but I still have to go through the trial and error process. And so I love that with regard to communion in this. My insufficiency is kind of the point. I wasn't up for the task, but Christ was up for the task. So, I mean, very much right now I relate to that statement, that somehow Christ still comes through. Christ is still proclaimed, even if I can't figure out how to make the music happen on the video. Right. Now, number 4, what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it keeps out. It is not who it keeps away from the table. It is who it invites in. Communion is about our communion with God, and it is also about our communion with each other. How is the act of taking communion with such very different people, people who you may not like or even respect, a radical act? So this question number 4 is actually, in fact, I might have quoted Rachel in my master's thesis. And the Seattle School does something, we call it a integrative project, but another school would probably call it a master's thesis. And we're required to integrate an aspect of psychology with theology, and give a presentation as sort of like a capstone presentation for our Master of Divinity degree. And I chose to focus on discussed psychology and integrate it with, the title of my thesis was called Dragging Dirt into the Sanctuary, Restoring Authenticity to the Church. And I used particularly a line from a novel by Craig Ferguson. And yes, the Scottish comedian Craig Ferguson, he wrote a novel probably, I think, in 2006. I'm not sure. I read it in 2009. So it wasn't new at the time I read it. And one of the reviews of that said it approached the sacred by way of the profane. And I'm not giving the title here because I want to first offer the preface. It is very profane. It is not something that I would read from in front of the church unless I found a particularly clean passage. But it affected me very much. And he deals with issues of philosophy and theology and God and faith. And in that sense, it's very beautiful, but it is not for the faint of heart. And so by all means, ask me about it. I may refer you to it, but I want to be able to have that conversation face to face, to just before someone goes and reads and goes, my pastor recommended this horrible book to me. It is beautiful, but it is an acquired taste. But anyway, that book, this is what makes the gospel offensive. Some people don't think of the gospel as offensive. If you've been raised as a Christian and the book is just beautiful to you, it's hard to understand when we hear what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it keeps out. It is not who it keeps away from the table. It is who it invites in. And sometimes you'll hear a big kind of blowhard preacher up there talking about a variety of sins that he thinks are terrible, or things that you and I might not consider a sin, but that he's calling a sin. And saying, those people aren't going to heaven. It's like that, the traveling preachers who have the big billboards with a list of things that they consider terrible. And saying, sometimes they'll include women preachers on those lists, the people who really don't think anyone's going to heaven. And generally the general public does find that offensive, but the thing is that guy is going to find an inclusive church offensive. And that's really, if you can think of the kind of person that you don't really want to sit down at worship with, most inclusive churches actually have the hardest time thinking, or the most publicly inclusive churches, the churches that, are flying a rainbow flag and have immigrants, etc. There is a population that they don't like and that they would have trouble with sitting next to. And usually those are more conservative folks, but the problem with why they wouldn't want someone more conservative sitting next to them is because they're afraid that person wouldn't want them being there. And that's the weird situation you find yourself in, of trying to be welcoming to all, but how do you be welcoming to the person who would choose to exclude yourself? That's where it becomes difficult, and I don't have an answer to that. But those are some of the things that I explored in my master's thesis and talked about. And we talked about actually the domains of disgust and how, and I mean, it really came up for me with the whole coronavirus situation, because we're afraid to share germs, which is something that hits the domains of disgust. And it's fair and reasonable that we need to be safe and careful and not spread disease. And so we're not doing in-person worship. We, even if we were, we probably wouldn't be doing communion in a way where anyone would be able to touch anyone else or even be close to anyone else, which does feel really counterintuitive to the purpose of communion, right? Because it is part of a being together and being one body, and we can't be that close to one another. So how do we be the body in each of our own houses, spread out and separated? And so we are going to be celebrating communion on Sunday. Hopefully you have some bread and wine or juice at home. In this instance, it's rare, it's strange, it's okay to be creative about those elements. I will have either pita bread or tortilla, just because we have a lot of that around our house right now, and we live in East LA, and tortillas are more common than a loaf of bread. So it is a little bit, Jesus chose bread and wine because those were the common elements of the world he was in. And this is the world we are in. And so if you don't have bread and wine, it is okay to be a little creative. Like I said, I'll probably have pita bread. I believe we do have a bottle of wine that I can pour. I grabbed a couple things from the church yesterday. I was able to get a sheet so I could have a backdrop, make it a little less distracting. And so we'll do communion on Sunday. I have, for those who can't get online, I have sent them a phone number to call, and they're going to call that phone number and they'll be able to dial in and participate in the worship service. I'll also be emailing that out, and I think the deacons are going to call around, but by all means, if you can think of someone you want to make sure gets connected and is able to participate in worship, when I send out that email, I will also send the phone number. I hope you all participate. There will be a link to use. But if you can also use the phone number, but also share that phone number. There's a phone number and a meeting ID, and you will need both. And share those with the folks who might be calling in because they don't have a computer or internet. Okay. Number 5. Rachel talks about being on her knees and cupping open her hand, and how this act is difficult because it shows how desperate she is to receive. What are the things that remind you about your reliance on God? You can tell these were written before the current situation, but I think, every day reminds you at this point, while we're waiting to know when we can leave our houses again for more than just a grocery trip. There's, at the end of this, there's a reflection from a priest here that I thought I'd read. It says, "I love to watch children come to the communion rail. So many of them come with awe and wonder that I find irresistibly beautiful. On a recent Easter Sunday, a little girl came forward for communion. Because this was a busy day, I was rocking and rolling, handing out bread right and left, trying to get to the hungry masses their holy mass before the crowd got impatient. I was going so fast, I almost lapped the little girl and her family. Although they had already received the bread and wine of communion, I had come back around to them before they had a chance to get their little flock up and out of the kneeling rail. I saw the little girl watching all the sights and sounds of Easter. I watched her as she watched me, all dolled up for the day in my shiny white gold silken robe, That is a chasuble for those of you who have mastered Episcopal vocabulary. Because I could see in her eye what she wanted, I asked her, "Do you want seconds?" She nodded vigorously. Just then, her grandmother, not knowing about our exchange, grabbed the girl's left hand and started to pull her away and moved her towards the pew. The little girl, walking backwards, reached out her right hand desperately and just barely in time to grasp the piece of communion bread I was giving her. Immediately, she pulled it back to her lips as if to kiss it, and she smiled the most precious smile I have ever seen. I remember thinking, little girl, you just taught your priest a lot about what Easter means. Gifts like these are the things I discover at the communion rail, not just the firsts of grace, but the seconds. Not that I don't like to hear myself talk, but I think Rachel is right. Communion is enough, or rather, it is more than enough. These kinds of little graceful surprises happen each and every week. This is what happens when you come to a holy place with an open, hungry soul. All right, and I did pick a text just to talk about. There's a great Book of Common Prayer. It's called Book of Common Prayer for Ordinary Radicals. And just realizing I have 2 copies in my office and I didn't grab one yesterday. I probably should have brought one back with me. But I have it on my phone, so you can read it from there. This is John chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And I chose that text. I know we have plenty of communion text, but next Thursday is Maundy Thursday, and so that's going to be the perfect night to talk about the Last Supper. And so I didn't want to read that text today, but since we are having communion on Sunday, I wanted to talk about communion as the theme. So I chose the text of Jesus cleansing the temple because it also resonates with what Rachel is talking about, that sometimes churches will try to sell Jesus and try to sell the gospel like a product. And Jesus has made it very clear how he feels about the sales and the marketing in the temple, that is not what the temple is there for. That the gospel is bigger and more beautiful than any product could ever be. And so we're not trying to sell something. We're trying to welcome people into a way of life. We're trying to include folks into something more profound. And so that's why I particularly chose that. But I love that text because it is Jesus getting angry, and sometimes we consider anger to be sinful, but when you think of the 7 deadly sins, wrath is a sin. Wrath is a much bigger, more dangerous thing. However, in the other different tellings of this particular story in the Gospels, Jesus does also stop and braid a whip that he cracks in the temple. It's not a nonviolent anger. But one of the things that's also important to note is that it takes time to braid a whip. He didn't just immediately run in there and start knocking heads. He gave people time. People had time to sit there and watch him braid a whip. It was pretty clear what he was doing. It was known what he was doing. And so anyone who wanted to avoid that situation could have left long before. And so he also took his time and thought about it. This wasn't just a rash decision. So that's something to think about, but also in this context that we are offering Christ when we open up the church and when we offer communion, when we offer the sacraments, and that is enough. And as Rachel talks about, you don't need the young pastor in their skinny jeans. I do happen to be wearing skinny jeans today, but that's not necessary. What is important is that the gospel is rightly preached and that the sacraments are administered, and that we are offering Christ, and it's because we are offering Christ without condition, and we are offering communion to all who may approach. And that we are trying to find ways digitally to continue that and to welcome people into that, even when it's not safe to do it how we normally do it. That is what becomes important. And I deeply wish that Rachel were still alive. She passed away last year. If you haven't been part of these studies, she was quite young. Those films were only recorded, maybe a year or two before she passed. I wish she were alive now, in part to hear what she would say about the sacraments and about communion amid a global public health crisis. How do we do that? What does it look like? Nonetheless, there are folks that I'm talking with and discussing with, and there's actually a communion liturgy that has been published specifically for this coming Sunday. And so I am working through that, adapting it, seeing what will work for us. And I'm grateful that I am not in this alone. And that is also part of what communion is we are the body of Christ, and I'm able to see and witness to Christ with the people around me. And with that, thanks be to God. I will see you all on Sunday.